You can always tell a child that has been in a 4-year-old program or who has had appropriate early childhood experiences. It doesn't always have to be a 4-year-old program, but it's appropriate experiences at a child care center or with moms at home that know all the things that they need to be doing to get kids prepared for school. It can be a church program, but you know almost the minute they walk in the room.
We get information from that assessment, and a lot of it's because we get to sit one-on-one with that child and do the assessment. And as they come in the door and you greet them, and you have a child who's shy and still hiding behind mom, or they're a little apprehensive, and then you have those kids who come in and say, "Hi, my name is Johnny. What are we got to do today?" And I'm like, "You've been to pre-K. I just know it." Or you've had some kind of experience that has given you confidence to walk in this door and go, "Lay it on me. I'm ready to go."
Hi, everyone. I am Brittany McGill. I am in the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation, so a different ASPE than the instrument we heard about in the first panel, but I'm at the Department of Health and Human Services, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. I am really excited to be here today, though, because 20 years ago, I was here as a CROCUS fellow working on the very first years of the Oklahoma evaluation. And it's just really exciting to see sort of all the great contributions to the evidence base since that time. So I've been asked to make a couple announcements. The first, for our in-person attendees, we have some wonderful artwork right outside the auditorium, excuse me, from schools from TPS and from CAP. So please take a moment to check that out during the break or lunch or afterwards. Second, for updates throughout the day, you can follow @BillGormley25 on Twitter. So with that, I'll introduce our second panel today. So we're going to hear about the persistence and fade out through the elementary years of those skills acquired during preschool. So as we talked about in the first panel, we will have plenty of time for questions at the end. So for our virtual attendees, please send them out, submit them throughout the presentation, and we'll get to them towards the end. So for our first presenter is going to be Carolyn Hill, who is a senior fellow at MDRC. Next, we'll have Anna Johnson, who you met in the first panel, associate professor of psychology here at Georgetown. After that, we'll have Sara Amadon, who is a senior research scientist at Child Trends. And finally, we'll have Danielle Neves, who is the instructional leadership director for Tulsa Public Schools. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Carolyn.
Do you want me to sit here? Or Good morning. So happy to be here. I'm currently my name is Carolyn Hill. I'm currently at MDRC in our DC office, but for many years I was here. This was my home in the Georgetown Public Policy Institute and now the McCourt School, and was fortunate to work with Bill Gormley and Deborah Phillips and many colleagues on this project, and have the privilege of being able to work with them, learn from them, and understand and learn about the Tulsa Public School Pre-K program. So I'm grateful to be here and glad to be back. As Brittany mentioned, in this panel, we're going to think about whether those effects that you heard about in the previous session persist in later years. And the paper that I'll talk about, I'm not going to talk about the whole paper, I won't lead you through graphs, there's just one slide. We'll talk about some of the initial findings we had from that early cohort that Ted Gayer and Bill and Deborah analyzed earlier on, and we'll also look at a later cohort. So this paper is available in Early Childhood Research Quarterly, and the citation is at the bottom in case you're interested in some beach or bedtime reading. All right, so just to give you a little bit of context for how to think about the findings from this study compared with what you heard in the previous session. The analysis is a little different, and that's important to point out. So I want to build up to that and just be real clear about sort of the two groups that we look at here. We looked at two cohorts, which we called the early and late cohort, or earlier and later. Of course, there were many other cohorts of kids coming through in between these years, before those years, and after those years. These were the 2 years of data that we were able to analyze. And here we think about the children who were in TPS kindergarten in 01-02. So those were the children who could have been in TPS pre-kindergarten in 00-01. And there were many papers back in the day that kept track of these along the way. The later cohort here are children who were in kindergarten in Tulsa Public Schools in 2006-2007. So in the previous year, they could have been in pre-kindergarten in TPS or other schools in the state. We were fortunate to have some rich data sources to draw on, as you'll hear from other presenters in this panel and later in the day. And these are really, we're so grateful for folks in the Tulsa district, in the state of Oklahoma, teachers, families, and others for sharing their information with us. Protected, of course, but we could not have done these analyses and learned from them if not for willingness to share data. So we're very grateful for that willingness over time and at different times in different ways. In terms of administrative data, the study draws on administrative data from the district, from Tulsa Public Schools, from the Community Action Program Head Start program at the time, and from state administrative data. And this was really important in this and subsequent studies to be able to follow students and children who were both in Tulsa Public Schools as well as those who moved away from Tulsa. And that was really a key aspect of being able to do, because otherwise we would only be able to follow children who were in the district itself. That's an interesting group, but to look beyond the district alone was also an important thing to do. So having access to the state administrative data and being able to use that was very important. Also, we drew on data from surveys of parents of children in the Tulsa Public Schools. And those surveys were fielded when children were in their third grade year, when children in these kindergarten cohorts were in third grade. Ideally, we would have had the survey information at earlier years, sort of at the beginning of the study or even at the beginning of pre-kindergarten. That wasn't possible because it's life. And we were very fortunate to be able to have the data later when the children were in third grade. And this allows us to, in the analyses that I'll talk about in a little bit, just understand a little bit more about the families so that we can better match or compare children who are most similar. And that will be important in the analysis. The outcomes that this study looked at were test scores in third grade. And these were the Oklahoma State exams in reading and math. And the comparison group here was constructed in a different way. So the treatment group, or the intervention group, were children who attended Tulsa pre-K. And you've heard about that and have heard about that. Many of you know about that and have experienced that. The challenge here, as in the previous panel, was to think about how can we construct a comparison group of what would have happened to those children had they not participated in Tulsa pre-K. And we couldn't do a randomized controlled trial, couldn't do a random assignment study. You heard in the previous panel that a regression discontinuity design was used to estimate effects at kindergarten. Well, as it turns out, kids age, kids grow up, and they go into school. So in estimating effects at third grade or any other point past kindergarten, where you don't have that nice clean cutoff that the previous panel talked about, we need to figure out another way to understand how the experiences of kids who were in pre-K might have differed had they not participated in pre-K. And the challenge here is that you want to think about finding a comparison group that's most similar to those kids. Ideally, you would get those exact same kids and have them not go to pre-kindergarten, to Tulsa pre-K, those exact same kids. we can't do that either, as it turns out. And so we have to think of other ways. The method that we use in the study is we construct a comparison group. So we approximate what that experience would have been. And we look at children who, in the data, who did not participate in the Tulsa pre-K system, in the Tulsa pre-K program. And we try to find ones that are most similar to those who did participate in the Tulsa pre-K program based on various characteristics of their mother's education, their age, the language they speak at home, sort of other characteristics of the family. I like to think about this method as instead of thinking about the ones who are most similar, that's a helpful way to think about it. It's also removing those who are least similar. It's just the other side of the coin. And I think that one, for some reason, often sort of resonates more. So I'm removing potential children from the comparison group who are kind of most unlike the children who were in Tulsa pre-K. So that's how we approximate this counterfactual or approximate what might have happened to those kids who did experience the program but actually did not. We construct these matches with something called propensity score matching. It's just kind of a fancy way, and there's more details in the paper, it's just a fancy way of kind of finding similarities and identifying differences. And the paper talks about how we were pretty confident in how we did this. And we looked at different sensitivity tests. There's a fundamental issue with this method, and I'll just put it out there, which is it can't match on things you don't observe. It sounds kind of no-brainer when you say it out loud, but it's easy to lose in all of the notation. There was recently something that my husband forwarded me that said propensity score matching on certain covariates would match now King Charles and I think Ozzy Osbourne. Did anybody see this? And it said where propensity score matching goes wrong. And so that sort of puts a fine point on it. In this case, though, I'm not actually concerned about that kind of bad match because we were able, through these data sources, to use data on children from the district, from that same district, and from the same data sources, which really helped the strong comparison. We also did lots and lots of checks on the quality of the match, and we're fairly confident in that. We estimated the effects here with ordinary least squares regression, the workhorse, and included controls for some of these characteristics. And then we said, well, there are lots of choices along the way, so do any of those choices we make in how we estimated the propensity score, how we constructed the group, how we did any of these things that all have choices that we tried to document, do any of those things matter for the result we get? And so we detail those in the paper as well. All right, so what did we find? Our key findings were that for the early cohort, so let me start with the early cohort. It's the second one here. For the early cohort, we didn't find any statistically significant effects. So another way to say that for either reading or math for the early cohort, and we didn't find any statistically significant effects on math for the early cohort, so for those early years of implementation of the program. So this just means that the effect that we observed, we couldn't distinguish it from happening by chance. Not that implementation of the program was by chance or that impact alone was by chance, but that we knew that we were drawing from some sample and that we knew that our estimation had some error in it. And so statistical significance conveys that amount of uncertainty with this kind of estimation. So we're not able to distinguish what we saw from chance. So the conclusion here is not that the program doesn't work. Let me say that another way that doesn't include so many double negatives. We found no statistically significant effects. What we can conclude from that is that there's no evidence of effects. What we can't conclude is that there's evidence that the program doesn't work. We can't make that conclusion. So it's it's heartening if you if you follow the statistical path. But even more heartening is to think about the later cohort and the math scores for third graders. And we did find statistically significant effects with an effect size of about 0.2 standard deviations, or specifically 0.18 standard deviations, which for third graders is actually a fairly substantively significant or relatively large in magnitude effect of this program. And in the paper, we talk about various reasons that we might see this effect on math, but not reading for that cohort, and also talk about some of the findings across cohorts. I think I'll stop there for now, and shall I pass it over to Anna? And pass it over to Anna. All right, thank you.
Me again. Hi. I told you I'd be back. So I'm going to continue to talk about results from our second generation study, the Tulsa SEED study. I will not belabor the details of that cohort again. I'm going to talk about sustained preschool benefits and hints of persistence into third grade in this later cohort. So we might call it the late cohort, because your early was early 2000s. Your late was 2005, 2006. My late is kids who experienced pre-K in 2018. This continues to be a deep collaboration standing on the shoulders of many giants, both at OU Tulsa and TPS, CAP, Educare. So the key question in this presentation, remember my number line from before, this is a 7-year longitudinal study that started in 2016 and goes through the current school year when our kids are in 4th grade. This presentation is focusing just on the association between pre-K experiences when children were 4 years old and their third grade outcomes. They just completed third grade a few months ago, so this is relatively fresh data. So the key questions here are, do the positive effects of TPS school-based pre-K and CAP Tulsa Head Start persist to third grade? Which skills persist and which show faster convergence or fade out? And do other positive outcomes, maybe ones we haven't focused on as much as a field, emerge later on? And I want to just hover on that second bullet for a moment. Convergence is, I put fade out in parentheses, the field large, preschool evaluation field, has used fade out very commonly. It's shorthand, it's easy, it's very accessible. I want to really emphasize that what's happening when we see preschool impact fade out often, if you think about 2 lines, preschool non-attenders and preschool attenders, is that the non-attenders are catching up. It's not that preschool doesn't work, and I really like the way Carolyn said that. When we see statistically insignificant differences between the 2 groups, it is often because the non-attenders, as they accumulate years of school and exposure to classrooms and instructional practices, high quality classrooms and instructional practices in Tulsa in many cases, the gap closes. So what I'm interested in as children age is not, does a 1 year of a pre-K experience provide some inoculation, at least in test scores and things we see in classrooms, but rather, do those kids keep growing, even if the ones who didn't experience pre-K grow as well? In a perfect world, everyone's going to benefit from school, right? So the sample is slightly smaller than the subsample I discussed earlier because as time goes on, individuals leave the study. So we're down to about 694 low-income children participating in the Tulsa SEED study as of third grade. Know that there are not statistically meaningful differences between those who left and those who stayed as it relates to the size of our impacts and our results that I'll talk about. Again, preschool attendance is defined as a school-based public pre-K in TPS that includes 4 affiliated charter schools, CAP Tulsa Head Start, which includes a small handful of Educare children who attended Educare at age 4 in the year we collected our data. And we compare them to a small group of preschool non-attenders. So these are children who were in parental care or care with a family member or a relative. It is a small group. I was trying to get a lot done in the earlier presentation and didn't hover over that point, but that's important, and it was raised in the Q&A at the last panel. The penetration rate of pre-K in Tulsa is high. That's wonderful. That means a lot of kids who want pre-K are getting it. Everyone who wants it can get it. It's higher than a national average. It's very high. It's even higher in DC, if you would believe it. Close to 90% of eligible kids attend public pre-K. What that means is that the group of kids who don't do pre-K is very small. And that's who we're comparing to, using the same method that Carolyn described. The measures are, again, English language literacy, a couple different measures of math, and self-regulation. So for those who might have tuned in late, this is a broader set of outcomes than what much earlier pre-K research was able to collect. We do collect the same measures of letter-word identification that the earlier Tulsa study collected and applied problems. But one of the goals of our updated Tulsa Seed study was to really catch a broader set of potential outcomes that could be affected by pre-K. Or, in the language I like to use, might show convergence more slowly. Maybe pre-K kids maintain an advantage for longer, and it takes a little bit longer for the non-attenders to catch up on skills that not all kids learn the minute they walk into a classroom door. So here are our results, and this is a similar chart to what I showed earlier. I'm going to focus on the third grade outcomes, but I'm going to show you where we came from, kindergarten and first grade. I'm focusing on the third grade, the final set of vertical bars. Again, the orange triangle is TPS and those charter schools, and the blue square is Head Start. And anything that crosses the horizontal dotted line is non-significant. Those are confidence intervals. The effect sizes are shown there, and those are in standard deviation units. So what you see is that by third grade, scores on letter-word identification for preschool attenders, both groups, are no longer statistically significantly different from non-attenders. We also saw that in first grade, so it's continued convergence. Phonological awareness has also converged such that by third grade, preschool attenders are no longer showing an advantage on that skill. These are letter-sound correspondence, something that with a couple years of schooling, we would expect most kids to master. Expressive vocabulary is what we might call an unconstrained language skill. You can build your vocabulary until you die. So this is something that has a ceiling, and kids can continue to grow. Assuming that preschool attenders and non-attenders both continue to grow, preschool attenders should kind of start ahead and stay ahead, and that's what we see. That's barely a statistically significant advantage for the orange triangle, but it is one. And for comprehension, again, barely statistically significant, what we would call at the marginal level of statistical significance for both groups there. So if I had to summarize this slide, I would say that there is suggestive evidence of sustained effects in third grade, specifically for the more complex language skills that most prior studies have not assessed. For math, applied problems is the math test that most prior studies have used. We've got a marginally significant sustained benefit by third grade. So yes, convergence is happening. The distance is getting smaller between non-attenders and attenders. But attenders are maintaining a relatively large effect size and advantage there. And on our measure of numerical fluency, which I talked about earlier, that is a more nuanced, precise measure of math than a word problems that conflates language. How many dogs do you see in this picture? If I added 6 dogs, how many dogs would you see then? That's a math word problem. Numerical fluency is I'm going to flash 2 numbers at you. Tell me which one is bigger. Believe it or not, that differentiates math skills into adulthood. I'm not particularly good at math. Many of my graduate students are. I guarantee you I would come in milliseconds behind them if you gave me that test. So differentiating symbolic numerals quickly and accurately is a measure of math that doesn't hit a ceiling. And lo and behold, preschool attenders continue to show an advantage on that skill into third grade. And our measures of self-regulation, which our SEED study was really designed to dig into and disappointingly did not show any statistically significant advantage for preschool attenders back in kindergarten and first grade, seems to be showing some action by the time kids get into third grade. So on the middle and far right panel, those are measures of inhibitory control, attention and task persistence, and working memory, keeping things in your kind of mental desktop, your scratch pad. We see a statistically significant advantage for the orange triangle, the TPS pre-K attenders, on inhibitory control, and it is marginally significant for working memory, and Head Start really peels away in working memory, positive impacts on working memory by third grade. This is really, really important. These are the skills that underlie success in school and in life. So much has been made of the importance of attention and persistence and working memory as skills that underlie life success. So many of our longer preschool studies, some of which we're going to hear about shortly and after lunch, have hypothesized that reasons for positive long-term effects on really consequential adult outcomes are due to something pre-K did to self-regulation, and until now it has not been documented. So we are the first study to document directly assessed self-regulation skills positive impacts at 3rd grade. I would say that's a nugget, if we're looking for a nugget. That's my nugget. So the positive benefits of public preschool in Tulsa persist in 3rd grade. The strongest and most persistent effects are on this nuanced measure of math, numeracy, and self-regulation. We are the first study to document these effects on directly assessed self-regulation in later elementary school. Prior studies that have done this have only looked as far as kindergarten. We do find weaker effects on language and applied problem solving. Were we to use only this outcome measures that prior studies have used, we too would conclude full convergence. We're finding a different story when we use broader measures, but our story is relatively similar when we use those same measures. We have not yet looked at state test scores, thanks to Lauren Jinks-Jones and our partners up there. Hello. We're going to be pulling those data in shortly, and I am very hopeful we'll find a similar positive pattern, particularly for math. So fade-out happens, convergence, on basic literacy, including that commonly used measure of letter-word idea, but we have lots of reasons to be hopeful that positive benefits will sustain in our wider, deeper set of measures in our Tulsa Seed study. So thank you to all my collaborators, my wonderful graduate students, and all of our funders.
Good morning. Thank you. Is this it? Oh, it's so small. Okay. Good morning. My name is Sara Amadon. I am a senior research scientist at Child Trends, and as others have come up here and kind of described their connection and evolution to this study, so my daughter was an infant when I joined working with Deborah and Bill as a postdoc, and she texted me this morning. So that is also how kind of my daughter has grown up with this study and how I in my career have also grown up with this study as well. So my deep gratitude to Bill and Deborah, who are the lead authors, the leaders of this study, and I'm happy to share what we found for middle school. So, and also just situate us, so this study, and then the next panel I'm also talking about this continuation of this study is looking at that kind of what we can call the first gen study. So the 2005, they attended pre-K in 2005, 2006. So Deborah's discussion about the quality of the classroom and Ted's discussion about the early impacts, that's the same cohort we're talking about today. So, and thankfully, we've had also Carolyn describe the methods, which I don't have to get too much into. We do use propensity score matching, or we've transitioned to use weighting, which is a similar strategy kind of to make sure we're comparing apples to the extent possible on observables. And so just to orient us as well, so in this two papers that I'll be discussing, it is the Tulsa pre-K alumni, those students who attended TPS pre-K, also those students who attended CAP Head Start, compared to those who didn't attend either. As we've discussed, that we don't know a ton about where they, what they did do, but we know they weren't in those two programs. So we relied on a lot of data in these two middle school papers. So we've had wonderful partners, as we talked about, from Tulsa Public Schools. We also, Bill and Deborah established these great working relationships with Union Public Schools, Broken Arrow, Jenks. And the high school paper that I'll talk about next, we also worked with an online charter school in Oklahoma. We also work closely and thankfully with the Oklahoma State Department of Education, who also provided us with some data. And so I do outline this up here, those in kind of red, that circle is what we got from the state. So that's actually a larger sample, right? We were able to track students who left the Tulsa metro area. And in the blue, those are the outcomes that we were looking at for those 4 public school districts. We also, in the middle school paper, in the middle school study, we also administered a student survey to look at this set of outcomes. It was administered to all 8th graders, and then the 7th graders we identified who had been grade retained. And this was a set of outcomes that we looked like at that time. It looked at so indicators of school engagement, indicators of grit and persistence, and some indicators of risk-taking as well. And also to orient us, we started off, the original sample was about 4,000 students who started kindergarten in 06, 07. As we've discussed, there's people move, there's attrition, and so we have both students who were in 7th and 8th grade, students in TPS and outside of TPS, and also, importantly at the bottom, that's the breakdown of the students in our middle school sample who had attended pre-K, who had attended CAP Head Start, and those who had attended neither. So as you'll see, it's a similar breakdown of students who didn't attend anything and who attended pre-K, a much smaller sample in our study that attended CAP Head Start. So what did we find? So I'm going to first start off talking about pre-K and talking about the school administrative data that we looked at. So actually rather like our elementary school findings, the 3rd grade paper, we do find that students who attended Head Start had significantly higher math standardized test scores. And that's what we're seeing here. We do not, well, I'll wait and talk about Head Start. So that's just the pre-K sample right there. Then we looked at some other indicators and this is from the school district data. We looked at whether or not students were enrolled in an honors course. And we actually find that students who attended pre-K were significantly more likely to also have taken an honors course. And then this is kind of one of the most robust sets of findings that we've seen over the years, which is that also pre-K students were significantly less likely to be retained in grade by quite a large margin. As you can see, that's a 7 percentage point gap. What do we see for CAP Head Start? We actually find another interesting set of findings as well. Those students who attended CAP Head Start, again, compared to similar peers, were significantly less likely to be chronically absent. Their math scores also were significantly higher. They also were less likely to be retained in grade. And interestingly enough, we didn't find much that Bill entitled the student survey paper, "The Dog That Didn't Bark," because there wasn't a lot, which is also another important finding as well. We know that those null results don't always get reported. So actually for the Head Start students, we do see that they were actually more cautionary of risk-taking behaviors, and they did demonstrate some stronger goal-setting behaviors as well, which is often called in the field grit. So it's also important to reveal that we looked at a lot of other things that we did not find were associated with pre-K or Head Start, and so this is the list. So as probably you've gathered, there were no associations with those reading test scores, nor for GPA for both samples. We also saw no associations with special education. We looked at in-school and out-of-school suspensions. There was no relation. And most of our student attitudes and indicators of student engagement also were not associated. You also see then there were some differential findings for Head Start and pre-K in terms of things like honors course taking and in how we measured attendance. So I want to talk a lot about limitations. Carolyn did a great job of describing some of the limitations of propensity score matching or weighting. There could be unobservable differences, and that's always going to be one of the problems with this study. I will say we did have a robust set of covariates we've always matched them on, and we do think they're probably likely to be correlated with other things we didn't measure that also should help soak up some of those and explain, better match some of those students, I should say. So if there is a takeaway here, as of middle school, we do see that there are some lasting associations with attending Head Start and pre-K on an important set of outcomes. What we don't have the time to talk about today, but I think any of us are happy to talk about, is our subgroup findings, so please find me at lunch or later this afternoon. We do find some important differences by students' gender and by their race, ethnicity as well. often favoring students such as Hispanic students, Native American students, actually, that those associations were often larger. Same with boys. But again, happy to talk more about that later on. And I will turn it over to Danielle.
Hello and good morning. I don't have a fancy slide because as the practitioner on this panel, I want to actually respond to what we've heard on these last two panels. My name is Danielle Neves. I currently serve as the Instructional Leadership Director over our high schools in Tulsa Public Schools. The previous 8 years, I worked as the Deputy Chief of Academics, so working very closely with our early childhood program, our elementary programs, and our secondary programs from the academic side. One of the things that I think is really critical as we look at all of this research is to think about, why do we think this matters? We've got a lot of researchers today, a lot of studies about what we believe the impact of students attending pre-K will be on their experiences in school and elementary, their outcomes in middle school and high school. And the reason this is so important is because all of the schooling that we're doing across the pre-K through 12 space is about preparing students for what will come after graduation, preparing them for their adult lives. And when we look at what it's going to require for our students to be successful in their adult lives, we're looking at test scores, right? Especially if our students want to attend post-secondary institutions of learning, we know that they're going to need some test scores and some academic cognitive skills for that. But we also know that college and workplace readiness requires collaboration, communication, problem solving, and critical thinking, all skills which show up to some degree on our academic cognitive exams, but also really are tough to measure. Our friends in industry often tell us that they know it when they see it, but it's harder to figure it out on the way in. And so this research about looking at the persistence around self-regulation is really key. Because when we talk about our students in late elementary school, in middle schools, and in high schools, one of the things that we see in practice as a differentiating feature between students is their ability to continue to try, their ability to think about things in different ways. We see that in some of the math research the math studies that we've talked about in terms of the flexible thinking, the ability to think about math in different ways. And so constantly within our school systems, we're looking for ways to provide the additional supports for our students across the continuum. And one of the things that I think has been really interesting that I've been taking notes on across this morning has been, if we have students who attend pre-K and so then start kindergarten with more school readiness, more of those literacy skills, more of those math skills, some of these social emotional learning skills, then what is the response of the teacher and the teams at the schools? Their response is often to figure out what additional supports, what additional scaffolds, what additional academic interventions can be provided to those students who aren't coming in with those skills. And so when Sara talks about that fade out or that convergence, it makes sense from where we sit, right? Because if we have students who come in with more letter naming skills, with more skills with sounds and literacy, then the teacher, the TAs, the other staff in the schools are gonna put their energy into bringing up the other students. And so we do see that catch up. And so then we wonder, as we look, and I'm excited to hear about the high school research in our later studies, because as we look forward, how are those other skills that students are coming in with in terms of how they work with others, in terms of their readiness for the social demands of school that are different from home, and also their ability to communicate with each other, both in their home languages and in the language of school. This is really exciting research. One last note as I close is that as we look at the research from Generation 1 and Generation 2, I will say that I am a proud parent of a Tulsa Public School student who is in grade 4 and has watched the Generation 2 research since its first year. I remember at pre-K orientation, having the researchers there, introducing the study. My child is not one of the study participants, but all through kindergarten and first grade, he would often say, "Oh, Mommy, the OU people were there again in our classroom today, seeing what we were doing." He always asked me if I know them because I'm working on my doctorate at OU as well. So I really just want to say thank you to everyone on the panel and all of those of you who are here, who we'll hear from later. This research matters because it helps us understand all of the supports we can provide to students across the early years of school that then will support them across their later years and help us make sure that every single student is prepared. Thank you.
All right, everyone, we have about 10 minutes left for questions. Do we have any online questions?
I have one.
Okay. Why don't we start with the online? Okay, so the question is, what is the funding structure for Tulsa pre-K by classroom or by slot, blended or more like public school funding classrooms, and any effect of that on outcomes? It's a big question.
I could answer it, but I do feel like that we have people from Tulsa in the room, so it doesn't seems like others could answer it. We in our papers and what we were told at the time, I know, was that pre-K is funded as all other grades. So it's the same amount of money you get for a student in pre-K as a student in 11th grade, and then the district uses those funds and allots them accordingly.
I would add that our pre-K classrooms are also funded and expected to have both a teacher and a teaching assistant at a ratio of 20-1, which does not hold once we get past our pre-K years. So.
Great, thank you. All right, questions in the room? See one over here. We have a mic coming.
Thank you. My question, I think, is directed at Anna, but I'd be interested to hear everyone's perspectives. I think that we've talked for a long time about this concept of like expecting pre-K to inoculate children. You mentioned that metaphor. And it's really exciting to see the results that you have around the potential of us measuring the wrong things, right? And then seeing some of these skills that are less constrained, sustaining these benefits and impacts further on. I wonder if your SEED project in particular is looking at at some of the things we discussed in the last panel around what's happening in the classroom, and what kindergarten, first, second grade teachers are doing and how they may be approaching instruction, and whether or not that has an impact on sustaining some of the outcomes that you're seeing.
That's a great question. So seated right behind you are the worker bees who are addressing that exact question right now. That is our next, right? So I think we felt as a study that we needed to first really wrap our heads around, are there impacts? We have subjected, with a 5 to 7 minute presentation, I was very limited in what I could say. And so, I would have loved to go into, I kind of relied on Carolyn and Sara to talk about that. We did all the things to try to, robustly test the strength of the effects. And that took a long time. And to look at all these different outcomes in all these different ways. And I think we felt like we needed to feel really rock solid on those impact findings before we discussed whether there was something to either moderate or mediate, which I think is your question, which is an excellent one. So now we're entering that phase of our study, and it involves harder conceptual thinking than methodological thinking in a way. So the challenge to this point has been, how can we identify this comparison group of it's small and it's families who selected not to do pre-K, and that makes them inherently different. How can we balance them on observable covariates? How can we weight them and kind of discard or downweight the ones who don't look at all like they ever would have attended pre-K? That was the challenge of these papers. I think the challenge of the next phase is conceptual, and like, what are the active ingredients, as Deborah said, that's happening in those kindergarten and first grade classrooms that sustain the boost that we're seeing. And I think the answer is probably not the class, because as we discussed earlier, it doesn't seem to strongly predict outcomes. So we're gonna look at a lot of those other more nuanced features, and we have spent a lot of time, our team in Tulsa, measuring individual teacher-child interactions, the quality of the teacher-child relationship, using other observational tools besides the class that are specifically focused on the self-regulatory classroom environment. So what are the things that promote self-regulation, as Danielle said, because we know that's important, and maybe teachers are responding differently to pre-K graduates. Maybe they're not, and pre-K graduates start ahead and kind of stay ahead for a while. Maybe they start ahead and kind of gain speed. We have a lot of questions, and I think we have the data to answer it, but we're just not there yet.
Another question? Here in the corner.
Hi, thank you so much for all of this. It's really interesting. My question is about like what has changed in the pre-K programs over time, and I guess maybe also what stayed the same, whether that's class sizes, pedagogy, and do you expect that does that impact your expectations for differences between Gen 1 and Gen 2, as well as perhaps your hypotheses moving forward?
I think I'll just say first, the policies have stayed the same. So a lot of the structural elements are going to be the same. Things like student-teacher ratios, the number of teachers in the classroom, teacher educational requirements. But I'm not at all qualified to say that about, I think it sounds like there's been some new curricula that have been adopted and other pieces like that. And but I will just say that in terms of pure policy and those like required inputs, that those things have stayed consistent.
Another.
Yeah.
Yeah, something to add from our Tulsa colleagues?
Yeah.
You have a mic coming right down behind you.
Yes, there have been changes in curriculum and pedagogy, but most of them have happened since the late study. Kids were in pre-K. So we have made, as I mentioned, some changes to curriculum starting in 2020 and doing a lot more supports around pre-K in our pre-K program and launching a department. But most of those wouldn't have shown up in the pre-K kids that were included in the study.
Great, thank you.
I want to note just demographic changes as well, which is a category that wasn't mentioned, but there have been enormous demographic changes. And interestingly, the first generation study identified in one of their many impact papers that Latinx families, children from Latinx families, were seeming to show stronger pre-K benefits. It's one of the subgroup analyses that I forget which one of you mentioned you didn't have time to talk about. We have a much larger proportion of Latinx families, which reflects demographic changes nationally and in Tulsa. And could that be driving larger sustained benefits? We don't know yet, but it's a candidate explanation.
Do we have something to add from Cap Tulsa?
Sure, just quickly, I'll say from a curriculum standpoint, between the two studies, we did introduce an evidence-based math curriculum during that time to supplement our creative curriculum, and so I would like to think that's probably contributing to the math benefits we're seeing later. We also introduced a far more robust instructional coaching model to help prepare teachers and share best practices, and and different types of implementation guides for classroom practice were developed between these two studies. And I would say teacher preparation in general, I think, has just been strengthened between the two studies. So I would say, actually, there are numerous differences, at least from Cap Tulsa's perspective, and also professional learning communities and the use of data to inform classroom practice is a monumental change in our program from the early to the later study.
Well, and this might be worth, the teacher strike, the Oklahoma teacher strike did raise the wages quite a bit, but was that?
It happened during our study.
Okay, right, of course, ideally. Right. That's ideal. That's what you always like as a researcher, a good old-fashioned strike. So yeah, it's like the wages and compensation, I think, it's on like literally during, I guess, your year.
Well, I think as we're winding down, if I can take the moderator's prerogative to ask a final question, kind of similar to the one that was raised at the end of the first panel. So my office at HHS, we advise the Secretary of Health and Human Services on policy issues. So, especially in light of some of these, seeing fade out in at least some of these outcomes, like what's the one key takeaway? If policymakers take nothing else away from this presentation, what's the one thing that you would want them to remember?
I mean, I'd say in a pre-K program, a mature universal pre-K program, that across 2 different cohorts of students that you do see through elementary school and middle school, and we'll talk about high school later, some robust indication of sustained benefits for those who attended Tulsa Pre-K, and to a certain extent Cap Head Start as well. So I think that would be again, you have to provide universal, it is school-based, you know, we have to make sure we're talking about, we know what we're talking about, but those would be my thoughts.
Anything else? Or from the practitioner's perspective?
I think it's the same thing I said before, which is that pre-K matters. It matters that we bring our students into a learning environment where they can be supported, where they can develop those social emotional skills. And I think we're seeing those glimpses through these studies, and we'll continue to see how that plays out, and we'll see that benefit holding on as students move through school.
Great. Well, thanks so much. I'm sure we could sit here and ask questions sort of all afternoon. So I encourage you, if you do have questions, to sort of approach our illustrious presenters afterwards. But thanks very much.